Here is your eviction notice and here is a breakdown of the back rent you owe us. You have until 5 o'clock this evening to get your things out of my basement." My mother Vivian slid a thick manila folder across the Christmas dinner table, pushing it right over the roasted ham. I stared at the paperwork, the holiday jazz music playing in the background, feeling like a sick joke. "My name is Sienna. I am 34 years old, a forensic auditor, and for the last 5 years, I have been paying my parents $3,500 a month to live in a windowless basement. If you have ever had your own family bleed you dry while treating you like a burden, you know exactly how cold the room gets when the people who are supposed to protect you decide you are expendable." The Christmas gift I gave them in return was one they will never forget, but to understand how we got to the bank vault, you need to see how they pushed me out the door. "You are kicking me out on Christmas morning?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. "I paid rent on the first of the month, Mom. I have never missed a single payment." "Rent for a basement," my younger sister Jada chimed in, lazily sipping her mimosa. "Bradley and I need the entire brownstone, Sienna. We are gutting the basement tomorrow to build a custom wine cellar. Bradley's development firm requires him to entertain elite clients. We cannot have a glorified accountant living downstairs. It ruins the aesthetic." I looked at Bradley, my white brother-in-law, to-be, who was leaning back in my grandfather's antique armchair, with his feet propped up on the mahogany coffee table. He offered me a patronizing smile, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive designer sweater. "No offense, Sienna," Bradley said smoothly, swirling his bourbon, "but this historic Harlem brownstone is wasted on you people. Jada and I are modernizing it to flip the equity. Your rent check barely covers the property taxes anymore. It is time for you to find a little apartment you can actually afford on an auditor's salary." That was my family. Grandfather built this historic home during the civil rights movement. When he passed away 5 years ago, my parents Desmond and Vivian claimed he left the house to them. They charged me exorbitant rent because I had shamed them by refusing to marry a wealthy pastor. Instead, they treated Jada like royalty because her fiancé promised to elevate their status into old money circles. They never hid their blatant favoritism. To them, my profession was an embarrassment because it did not come with an immediate invitation to the country club. I swallowed the deep, bitter resentment that had been building inside my chest for decades. I refused to let them break me today. "I paid $210,000 in rent to you over 5 years, Dad," I said, looking at my father, Desmond, who would not even meet my eyes. "And you are throwing me out on the street for a wine cellar." "Do not be dramatic, Sienna," my father snapped, slicing his ham with aggressive precision. "The deed is in our name. We make the rules in this house. Pack your bags. Bradley's demolition crew is coming tomorrow morning at dawn." "Hi is right," Vivian added, taking a sip of wine. "We must think about the family legacy. Bradley is bringing real wealth. You just sit behind a computer looking at spreadsheets. Jada's future requires sacrifices, and as the older sister, you should be happy to step aside." I looked at the four of them sitting around the table, wrapped in their delusions of grandeur. They really believed they had won. They thought that because I was quiet, I was weak. But as a forensic auditor, I made my living by finding the lies people buried in paperwork. I did not scream. I did not beg. I did not throw my glass or flip the table. Emotional reactions were exactly what they wanted. It would give them an excuse to call the police and play the victims. I simply stood up, walked down the narrow stairs to my basement room, and pulled out my single suitcase. Before I zipped it shut, I reached under my mattress and pulled out a small, tarnished brass key. It was the last thing my grandfather ever gave me before taking his final breath. "Do not let them sell our history, Sienna," he had whispered to me in his hospital bed. "Go to the First National Bank on Fifth Avenue. Ask for Mr. Sterling." For 5 years, I had been too drowned in grief and overworked at my firm to figure out what the key meant. I had blindly trusted my parents when they read the supposed will. But today, looking at the eviction notice upstairs, I had nothing left to lose. I dragged my suitcase up the stairs and toward the front door, ignoring Jada's mocking wave from the parlor window. "Good luck starting over," Jada called out, laughing as she linked her arm through Bradley's. "Maybe you can audit yourself a new apartment." "Merry Christmas, Jada," I replied calmly, stepping out into the freezing December air. "Make sure Bradley does not start swinging sledgehammers too early." I walked down the brownstone steps, the heavy door slamming shut. I hailed a cab and slid into the back seat, the brass key burning a hole in my pocket. My family thought they had discarded a useless burden to clear the path for their new lifestyle. They had no idea they had just handed me the shovel to dig their graves. "Fifth Avenue, please," I told the driver. As the taxi pulled away from the Harlem neighborhood I had called home my entire life, I looked out the frost-covered window. The holiday lights blurred as we drove toward the city center. I was about to unlock a secret vault that would unleash absolute financial devastation upon everyone sitting at that dinner table, and they would never see it coming. The cab dropped me off in front of the towering stone pillars of the First National Bank on Fifth Avenue. The holiday winds whipped around my coat, but I did not feel the cold. I marched up the granite steps and pushed through the heavy revolving doors. The main lobby was practically deserted due to Christmas morning, but a single teller stood behind the high-end concierge desk reserved for premium clients. I walked straight up to her and placed the tarnished brass key on the cool marble counter. "I need to see Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "My name is Sienna Hayes." The teller glanced at the key, and her polite customer service smile vanished instantly. Her eyes widened. She picked up her heavy desk phone, whispered a few urgent words, and hung up. Less than a minute later, a distinguished older African-American man in a perfectly tailored suit hurried out of the frosted glass double doors at the back of the lobby. It was Mr. Sterling. He looked at me, then looked down at the brass key resting on the marble. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound relief and deep concern. "We have been waiting for you for 5 long years. Please come with me right now." He led me down a long, quiet hallway and ushered me into a massive, mahogany-paneled corner office. The moment I stepped inside, he closed the heavy oak doors and locked them with a loud, definitive click. The sound made my heart pound against my ribs. He walked over to his grand executive desk, pulled out a thick leather-bound ledger from a secure drawer, and pushed it across the polished wood toward me. "Miss Sienna," he said, taking a deep breath and gesturing to the leather chair across from him. "You need to sit down." I sat slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the massive ledger. "Mr. Sterling, what exactly is this? My parents just evicted me from my grandfather's house. They handed me a bill for back rent and told me I have until 5 o'clock tonight to vacate the basement." Mr. Sterling let out a harsh, bitter breath, shaking his head. "Your parents cannot evict you from that house, Sienna, because your grandfather never left the Harlem brownstone to them. The deed has been entirely in your name since the day he died. You own the house lock, stock, and barrel." The room started to spin. I gripped the armrests of my chair to steady myself. "But I have been paying them $3,500 a month in rent for 5 years," I stammered. "I know," Mr. Sterling said, opening the ledger to a page filled with meticulous financial records. "Because every single month your parents transferred that exact $3,500 into this hidden account. But that is not even the worst part." He turned the ledger around so I could read the bottom line. As a forensic auditor, I process numbers faster than most people read words. What I saw on that page made the blood freeze in my veins. "6 months ago, your father Desmond forged your signature to take out a $5 million commercial mortgage on the brownstone," Mr. Sterling explained softly. "And he transferred every single penny of that fraudulent loan directly into your brother-in-law Bradley's real estate development firm." The air was violently sucked out of my lungs. My own parents did not just charge me illegal rent to live in my own basement. They had committed massive federal fraud to fund the very arrogant white man who was currently mocking my career and gentrifying our family legacy. "Bradley's firm is practically bankrupt, Sienna," Mr. Sterling continued, leaning forward. "He has been laundering money through your father's accounts to keep his creditors at bay. He targeted your sister Jada specifically to gain access to your family's assets. Your father was foolish enough to fall for the prestige Bradley promised." My sadness completely evaporated. The tears that had been threatening to fall instantly dried up, replaced by a cold, clinical, and absolute focus. Following the money was what I did best, and my family had just handed me the master ledger of their own destruction. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice dripping with ice, Why did my grandfather give me this key? What else did he leave me besides a house with a forged $5 million mortgage? Mr. Sterling smiled, a dangerous, predatory glint shining in his dark eyes. Miss Hayes, your grandfather held original patents in telecommunications from the early 1980s. He lived modestly, but his investments were aggressive. You do not just have enough liquid assets to pay off that forged mortgage. You have enough to buy Bradley's entire firm, fire him, and still have enough left over to buy the bank we are sitting in. I leaned back in my chair, pulling my phone out of my pocket. Perfect. Call my corporate lawyers immediately. I want the deed, the mortgage paperwork, and the full trust accounting ready in 1 hour. I have an eviction notice of my own to serve. Mr. Sterling stood up, but his expression suddenly turned grim. Sienna, there is one more thing you need to know, and we do not have much time. Bradley is not just building a wine cellar in your basement. I paused, my thumb hovering over my phone screen. What do you mean? I tracked the permits attached to that property address. Mr. Sterling warned, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Bradley filed for a commercial demolition permit yesterday. He is not renovating the basement. His demolition crew is arriving tomorrow at dawn to bulldoze the entire historic brownstone facade to the ground, so he can sell the empty lot to commercial developers and pay off his massive debts before the federal investigators audit his company completely. I spent the entire night locked in a war room with top-tier corporate litigators. By dawn, we were ready. A black town car pulled up to my grandfather's historic Harlem brownstone. The crisp morning air bit at my cheeks as I stepped onto the pavement. The street was blocked off by orange construction cones. A massive yellow bulldozer sat idling right in front of the property, exhaling thick plumes of diesel smoke into the air. A crew of 10 men in hard hats were gathered on the sidewalk, pointing at the intricate stonework my grandfather had carved. A burly foreman stood at the center, holding a clipboard. I recognized the logo on his jacket, Bradley's Development Company. I buttoned my coat and walked straight past the orange cones, planting my high heels firmly onto the bottom step of my property. The foreman turned around, his face twisting into a scowl as he looked me up and down. "Hey, lady, you cannot be standing there," the foreman shouted over the rumbling engine of the bulldozer. "This is an active demolition site. We are taking down the facade in 10 minutes. You need to clear the perimeter before we call the cops." "You are not touching a single brick on this building," I said, my voice ringing out clearly over the roar of the machinery. "Turn off the bulldozer and get your crew off my property." The foreman let out a loud, mocking laugh, looking back at his men who snickered in response. He stepped closer, trying to use his sheer physical size to intimidate me. "Look, lady, I do not know who you think you are, but I have a signed work order from the property owner. Bradley authorized this demolition and we are on a strict schedule. Move out of the way or my guys will physically move you. If one of your men so much as breathes in my direction, I will personally see to it that they never work in commercial construction again." I fired back, not breaking eye contact. "I do not care what fraudulent paperwork your boss gave you. Bradley does not own this house, and he certainly does not own the ground you are standing on." Before the foreman could respond, 2 sleek black SUVs pulled up behind my town car. The doors opened and 4 sharp-suited corporate attorneys stepped out, carrying thick leather briefcases. My lead counsel, Marcus, walked briskly up the steps and handed the foreman a stack of legal documents stamped with a red court seal. "What the hell is this?" the foreman grumbled, squinting at the paperwork. "That is a federal injunction," Marcus stated firmly, adjusting his glasses. "Signed by a judge at 3 o'clock this morning. It immediately halts any and all construction, demolition, or alteration to this property. Furthermore, if you look at page 3, you will see a cease and desist order regarding the corporate assets of your employer. The firm you work for is currently under investigation for severe financial fraud." The foreman's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. He flipped through the pages, his eyes darting frantically across the legal jargon. The idling bulldozer suddenly seemed incredibly loud in the tense silence. "My client, Sienna Hayes, is the sole legal owner of this historic brownstone," Marcus continued, projecting his voice so every worker on the street could hear. "She is also the primary creditor holding the debt of your employer's bankrupt company." If you proceed with this demolition, you will not just lose your job. You will be held personally liable for millions of dollars in property damage, and you will face federal charges for destruction of assets during an active financial investigation. The foreman swallowed hard. He looked at me, then at the bulldozer, and finally at the official court seal. He quickly pulled a walkie-talkie from his belt. "Shut it down," he barked into the radio. "Shut the machine down right now." The deafening roar of the bulldozer sputtered and died, leaving the street bathed in an eerie, ringing silence. The crew members immediately started backing away from the property, tossing their tools into the back of their trucks. I watched the foreman scramble to dial his phone, undoubtedly trying to reach a panicking Bradley. I had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. A sleek silver Mercedes suddenly sped around the corner, parking haphazardly next to a fire hydrant. The doors flew open and my parents, Desmond and Vivian, rushed out. They had clearly rushed over to watch the destruction of my home, eager to see their golden child's fiancé succeed. When my father saw the silent bulldozer and the retreating construction crew, his face turned a violent shade of purple. "What is going on here?" Desmond roared, stomping up the sidewalk toward the foreman. "Why are you stopping? I signed the conservatorship papers. You have legal clearance to tear this place down." "Dad, the only thing coming down today is your facade," I called out from the top of the stairs. My parents whipped their heads around, genuinely shocked to see me standing there. Vivian clutched her designer purse, her eyes wide with rage. "Sienna, what are you doing here? You were evicted. You are supposed to be gone." "I live here, Mom." I smiled coldly. "And I brought some friends to make sure you do not sell off grandfather's legacy to a white man who is drowning in debt." Desmond marched up the steps, pointing a trembling finger an inch from my face. "You ungrateful child! You think lawyers can stop me? I am your conservator. I speak for you." He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I need police immediately. I have a mentally unstable trespasser refusing to leave. She is dangerous and needs to be removed." He hung up the phone and smiled wickedly. "You want to play games? Let us see how you handle sitting in jail." The wail of police sirens pierced the crisp morning air, growing louder, until 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt right in front of the orange construction cones. 4 officers stepped out, hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Desmond immediately switched his demeanor from a raging tyrant to a concerned, helpless patriarch. He rushed down the brownstone steps. Vivian clutched his arm while Bradley and Jada stood watching with smug satisfaction. Desmond pointed a trembling finger at me, telling the officers that I was a hostile squatter who had lost her mind after being evicted. He presented his forged conservatorship papers to the lead officer, claiming I was a danger to myself and the construction crew. I did not fight back. I did not raise my voice or resist when the officer approached me. I simply held out my wrists and let them escort me into the back of the patrol car. Marcus, my lead attorney, gave me a reassuring nod, tapping the thick leather briefcase he held in his right hand. He was already dialing the precinct captain. My family smiled triumphantly. As the police car drove away, they had just given me a police escort to file federal fraud charges against them. The arresting officer placed me in a holding room, leaving the door cracked open while he went to process the paperwork my father had given him. Within 20 minutes, Marcus walked through the precinct doors alongside Mr. Sterling and a senior detective named Reynolds. Detective Reynolds looked tired. Marcus wasted absolutely no time. He unclasped his leather briefcase and spread the original watermarked deed to the brownstone across the metal interrogation table. I sat forward, pulling out the financial ledger. Mr. Sterling had provided, along with the digital audit trail I had mapped out on my tablet during the cab ride. I looked directly at the detective. I explained that I was not a squatter. I was a senior forensic auditor, and the man who had called the police had just handed them a fabricated legal document to facilitate a $5 million embezzlement scheme. Detective Reynolds raised an eyebrow. I pointed out the notary stamp on the conservatorship. It belonged to a man whose license had expired 3 years ago. I showed him the medical evaluation declaring me mentally unfit, highlighting that the signature belonged to a pediatrician who had never practiced psychiatry. Then I delivered the final crushing blow. I displayed the wire transfer logs proving that the moment the fraudulent mortgage cleared, the funds were funneled into 3 offshore shell companies registered to Bradley's development firm. His posture stiffened as he realized this was no longer a simple domestic dispute over an eviction. This was a highly organized, multi-million-dollar federal crime. He ordered my handcuffs removed. He apologized for the misunderstanding and asked if I wanted to press charges right then and there. I told him to hold off on the arrest warrants. I needed to finish auditing Bradley's entire corporate structure before the authorities spooked him into hiding the rest of the stolen money. Detective Reynolds agreed, keeping the forged documents as evidence for the impending federal investigation. Meanwhile, Desmond, Vivian, Jada, and Bradley were pacing the precinct lobby. They had followed the patrol car, eagerly waiting to see me thrown into a holding cell. When the heavy wooden doors swung open, their arrogant smiles froze. I walked out completely free, adjusting my coat, flanked by Marcus and Detective Reynolds. Desmond marched forward, his face red with indignation. He demanded to know why I was not behind bars. Detective Reynolds stepped squarely in front of my father, his hand resting on his utility belt. He informed Desmond that the only reason he was not leaving this precinct in handcuffs for filing a false police report and forging federal property deeds was because I had graciously requested leniency. The detective leaned in close, his voice dropping to a dangerous, authoritative growl. He warned my parents and Bradley that if they ever set foot near my historic brownstone again, or if they attempted to contact me, he would personally arrest them for felony fraud. My mother gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. Bradley took a nervous step backward, suddenly realizing his scheme to steal my heritage was unraveling. Jada opened her mouth to argue, but Bradley grabbed her arm and practically dragged her out of the precinct doors. My parents followed closely behind their heads, hung low in absolute humiliation. They had tried to use the law to destroy me, and the law had just handed them a final warning. Returning to the safety of my heavily guarded brownstone, I locked myself in my grandfather's old study. I booted up my encrypted servers and initiated an aggressive forensic audit of Bradley's entire development firm. If he was desperate enough to steal $5 million from my family, he was definitely hiding worse crimes. I bypassed his flimsy corporate firewalls and tracked every single dollar flowing through his business accounts. I worked relentlessly through the night, cross-referencing bank identification numbers and real estate escrow funds. The deeper I dug into his financial records, the more horrifying the truth became. Bradley had not just targeted my house. He had been bleeding my parents dry for years. I uncovered a series of hidden promissory notes and second mortgages. My parents had secretly liquidated their entire retirement portfolio and leveraged their own assets to invest in Bradley's fake commercial projects. They were completely, irrevocably bankrupt, living on credit cards while desperately trying to maintain their elite social status. But the final discovery made my blood run cold. I traced the remaining stolen funds from the brownstone mortgage. The money did not just go to an offshore account. It was being systematically routed back into the United States through a familiar domestic nonprofit organization. Bradley was laundering his stolen millions directly through the building fund of our prominent African American church, the very same congregation where my parents served as senior deacons. The following Sunday morning, I dressed in my sharpest tailored charcoal suit and drove to Greater Zion Fellowship. This was not just an ordinary church. It was the absolute epicenter of Harlem's elite African American society. Politicians, judges, real estate moguls, and business leaders filled the polished oak pews every single week. My parents, Desmond and Vivian, were senior deacons here. They wore their status in this building like a royal crown, using their church connections to secure social leverage and lucrative business deals. I walked through the heavy wooden doors just as the massive choir finished their powerful opening hymn. The ushers, people I had known since childhood, gave me tight, incredibly uncomfortable smiles. Word had clearly spread. Gossip in this community moved faster than a wildfire, and my parents had undoubtedly been planting seeds of deceit all week long. I slid into an empty pew near the very back of the sanctuary, placing my thick leather briefcase carefully on the velvet cushion beside me. Pastor Evans took the stage, his booming voice echoing through the grand vaulted sanctuary. He preached passionately about forgiveness, family bonds, and the dangerous sin of envy. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the front row. Desmond and Vivian sat perfectly upright, the picture of pious devotion. Jada rested her head dramatically on Bradley's shoulder, playing the flawless role of the stressed innocent bride-to-be. Bradley looked incredibly smug in his tailored designer suit, completely unaware that I had spent the last 48 hours mapping out every fraudulent wire transfer he had ever made into this very church's building fund. He honestly thought his money laundering scheme was secure. I thought my parents had neutralized me at the police station. When the time came for community announcements, my father stood up. Desmond smoothed his expensive suit jacket and walked solemnly up the carpeted steps to the pulpit. He shook the pastor's hand, his face a perfect, sickening mask of manufactured sorrow. The massive congregation fell completely silent, hanging on his every word. Desmond adjusted the microphone. He told the hundreds of people looking up at him that our family was currently going through a period of deep, devastating spiritual warfare. He said they were dealing with a heartbreaking trial involving their eldest daughter. He did not use my name at first, but every single head in the sanctuary slowly turned to look at the back pews where I was sitting. Vivian joined him at the altar, dabbing her dry eyes with a white lace handkerchief. My mother took the microphone from him, her voice trembling with practiced theatricality. She told the affluent congregation that I had suffered a severe, debilitating mental breakdown. She claimed I was consumed by bitter, uncontrollable jealousy over Jada's upcoming wedding to a highly successful developer. She lied effortlessly, telling the church that I had maliciously squatted in their home, violently harassed the construction workers, trying to build Jada's wedding gift, and even fabricated insane lies to the police out of pure spite. She asked the entire church community to pray for my troubled, dark soul. She painted herself as the long-suffering, endlessly loving mother who was simply trying to get her sick, unstable daughter the psychiatric help she desperately needed before she ruined her own life completely. Jada stood up from the front row, wiping away fake tears as if the emotional toll was just too much for her to bear. Bradley wrapped his arm tightly around her waist, kissing her forehead for the entire congregation to witness. He played the perfect wealthy white savior, comforting the distressed black daughter. Murmurs of deep sympathy rippled through the packed pews. I heard the older women clicking their tongues in pity. I saw the harsh judgment burning in the eyes of the church elders. My parents were executing a flawless, calculated public assassination of my character. They were systematically destroying my reputation in front of the most powerful people in the city, ensuring that if I ever tried to expose their financial crimes, absolutely no one would believe a word I said. They were trying to lock me in a permanent prison of public opinion. Pastor Evans returned to the pulpit, placing a comforting pastoral hand on my father's shaking shoulder. He looked directly at me through the sea of judgmental faces. He asked the congregation to bow their heads and extend their hands toward the back of the sanctuary to pray for my healing and immediate deliverance from the sins of jealousy and greed. The sheer audacity of their performance was truly breathtaking. They were using the holy altar of our community as a massive shield for their federal crimes. They fully expected me to run out of the heavy double doors in tears, humiliated, broken, and defeated by the crushing weight of their social power. They thought I would cower in the face of public shame and surrender my grandfather's legacy to save face. But they forgot one crucial, devastating detail about exactly who I really was today. I truly did not care about their fake social status. I did not care at all about the opinions of people who valued appearances over the absolute truth. I only cared about the financial numbers, and those numbers absolutely never lie. I did not bow my head in shame. I did not shed a single tear for their performance. I calmly uncrossed my legs, picked up my heavy leather briefcase, and stepped out into the center aisle. The murmurs of prayer abruptly stopped. The silence in the sanctuary became absolute, heavy, and deafening. Hundreds of eyes watched me in shocked disbelief. Desmond's fake sorrow vanished instantly, replaced by a flash of genuine, unadulterated panic as I walked straight down the long, red-carpeted aisle. I did not stop at the altar. I walked directly up the thickly carpeted stairs, bypassing my completely stunned parents, and confidently stepped right up to the heavy wooden pulpit to face everyone. Pastor Evans reached out to grab my arm, his face a mask of pastoral concern mixed with genuine alarm. I smoothly stepped out of his reach, placing both of my hands firmly on the polished edges of the heavy wooden pulpit. I adjusted the microphone. The high-pitched feedback echoed sharply through the vaulted ceiling, making several church elders flinch in the front row. My father Desmond stood frozen at the base of the altar. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. My mother Vivian clutched the fabric of her expensive designer dress, her eyes wide with mounting terror. "Good morning, Greater Zion Fellowship," I said, my voice projecting crisp and steady across the massive sanctuary. My father is absolutely right. Our family is experiencing a devastating period of warfare. But the attack is not spiritual, and it certainly is not coming from my fabricated jealousy. The attack is entirely financial, and it is happening right here, right now, inside this very building. A collective gasp rippled through the affluent congregation. Politicians adjusted their ties. Wealthy real estate moguls leaned forward in their perfectly polished oak pews. Jada jumped up from her seat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Turn her microphone off!" Jada shrieked, abandoning her perfect bride persona entirely. "She is having a psychotic break. Somebody get her out of here before she ruins everything." "The only thing breaking today is your illusion, Jada," I responded calmly into the microphone, my eyes locking onto hers. I turned my attention back to the hundreds of powerful people staring up at me. My parents just stood before God and this entire congregation to ask for prayers regarding my mental stability. They boldly told you all I was just an unstable, jealous daughter trying to ruin my sister's elite wedding. They did this because they knew I was sitting in the back row holding the truth about their fake wealth. Pastor Evans stepped forward, signaling the head usher to intervene. "Sister Sienna, please. We do not air family grievances at the altar. Let us pray for peace and handle this in private." "There is no peace when the foundation is built on federal fraud, Pastor Evans," I countered, not yielding an inch. "Since my parents decided to make my mental health a public record, I firmly believe it is only fair to make their current financial health fully public too. After all, transparency is a virtue we preach every single Sunday." I picked up my heavy leather briefcase and placed it squarely on top of the pulpit. The solid thud echoed through the silent room. I unclasped the brass locks. Right on cue, the traditional Sunday service proceeded out of sheer habit. 4 ushers marched down the center aisle carrying the large golden collection plates for the special holiday offering. They stopped at the front row, looking incredibly unsure of what to do next. "Perfect timing," I announced, grabbing a massive 2-inch thick stack of paper from my briefcase. "I have a special offering to submit today on behalf of Desmond and Vivian Hayes." I walked down the few carpeted steps and stopped directly in front of the head usher. Instead of dropping in a check or $100 bill, I slammed a thick packet of stapled documents into the golden collection plate. I grabbed another stack and tossed it into the second plate, then the third. "What are you doing?" Desmond hissed, his face turning an ash gray. He lunged forward to aggressively grab the private papers out, but the head usher instinctively pulled it firmly back. "Those are my parents' actual financial contributions to society." I projected my voice so the entire front half of the church could hear every syllable clearly. "Those are 5 different maxed-out credit card statements. Those are the secondary mortgage default notices on their luxury cars and supposedly paid-off vacation properties. Those are the liquidation records of their entire retirement portfolio." Whispers erupted into loud, chaotic chatter. The head usher looked down at the documents in the golden plate, scanning the bold red letters spelling out final notice of foreclosure. He looked up at my father in unadulterated shock. "Desmond Hayes, the wealthiest deacon in Greater Zion Fellowship, was completely bankrupt." "You are a liar," Vivian screamed, her voice cracking as she tried to snatch the papers from the ushers. "Do not look at those. She forged them. She is a sick, jealous girl." "I am a senior forensic auditor," I corrected her, my tone dropping to an icy calm. "I do not forge documents, Mom. I expose them. just like I exposed the fraudulent mortgage you and Dad took out on my historic brownstone. You stole my property to fund Jada's expensive wedding because you are absolutely broke. The sanctuary descended into total chaos. Church elders began standing up demanding answers. Wealthy socialites who had just yesterday attended Vivian's exclusive tea parties were covering their mouths in horror. Their pristine elite status was shattered. Jada sank back into her pew, sobbing hysterically, as the reality of her ruined social standing crashed down. Desmond stood frozen, staring at the foreclosure notices resting in the golden offering plates, knowing he could never show his face in Harlem again. I had finally defeated them. I had financially and socially eradicated them in front of the only audience they actually cared about. I turned my back on my completely ruined family and prepared to walk down the aisle and out the front doors. I had delivered my justice, and I was ready to leave them in the wreckage. Suddenly, the heavy sanctuary doors burst wide open. Bradley marched down the aisle, angrily waving a thick manila folder. "Nobody is leaving," Bradley shouted, his loud voice cutting through the murmurs. "I do not care what those statements say. I have a legal notice right here. I officially own Desmond's debt, and I am claiming this church's building fund as my rightful collateral today." Bradley stood at the front of the sanctuary, waving his fraudulent documents like a weapon. Pastor Evans stepped back, clutching his Bible, completely bewildered by the sudden escalation. The wealthy congregation murmured in absolute shock. Desmond looked at his future son-in-law with a mixture of terror and desperate hope, thinking Bradley was somehow there to save him. Jada stopped crying and quickly moved to stand beside her fiancé, fixing her designer dress and lifting her chin. She actually believed Bradley held the winning hand. I looked down from the pulpit, staring at the arrogant white developer who thought he could walk into a historic African-American church and demand its community funds to cover his own colossal failures. I did not raise my voice. I simply tapped the microphone, ensuring my words would resonate through the massive speakers. "You do not own anything, Bradley," I said, stepping down from the pulpit and walking slowly toward him. "You are holding a secondary promissory note that my father signed illegally. You thought you could use the church's building fund as leverage because my father is a senior deacon here. But you made one massive fatal miscalculation when you decided to commit federal wire fraud using my stolen property." Bradley scoffed, crossing his arms over his expensive tailored suit. "Save the forensic auditor routine, Sienna. I have the legal right to collect on this debt. Your father leveraged his entire contracting business, his retirement, and his standing in this church to secure my investments. I am calling in the collateral right now. This congregation either pays up or I seize the land this building sits on." Gasps echoed from the pews. Several church elders stood up in furious indignation. My mother, Vivian, buried her face in her hands, realizing the absolute destruction her greed had brought upon her sacred social sanctuary. Desmond tried to speak, but his voice completely failed him. I walked right up to Bradley and snatched the manila folder out of his hand. I did not even look at the paperwork. I ripped it cleanly in half and let the pieces flutter onto the red carpet. "You cannot seize this church, Bradley, because you no longer own the company that holds my father's debt," I stated clearly, watching his arrogant smirk falter. Yesterday afternoon, I took a very interesting trip to the First National Bank. I accessed the trust my grandfather left me, a trust built on original telecommunications patents from the 1980s. It turns out I have significantly more liquid capital than a failing real estate developer. I pulled my own smartphone from my tailored suit pocket and pulled up a digital financial portfolio, turning the screen so Bradley could see the glowing numbers. At 9 o'clock on Friday morning, I used my grandfather's trust to initiate a hostile corporate takeover, I explained, projecting my voice to the silent congregation. I bought out Vanguard Equity Partners. Vanguard is the private equity firm that owns the $18 million commercial debt you defaulted on last month. I bought your debt for pennies on the dollar, Bradley. I am the silent majority shareholder of Vanguard now. I do not just own the historic brownstone you tried to demolish. I own your construction equipment. I own your office building. I own the mortgage on your parents' summer home in Martha's Vineyard. I am your boss, and you are entirely bankrupt. Bradley's face drained of all color. He looked like he had been physically struck. He grabbed his phone and frantically dialed his chief financial officer. The congregation watched in gripping silence as Bradley held the phone to his ear, his hand shaking violently. I knew exactly what his executive team was going to tell him. They were locked out of their accounts, their assets were frozen by my legal team, and their corporate headquarters was currently being audited by federal investigators. Bradley dropped his phone. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. "You set me up," Bradley whispered, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "No, Bradley, you set yourself up," I corrected him sharply. "You tried to gentrify my family's legacy and use my parents' pathetic need for elite social validation to fund your failing empire. You thought you could walk in here and take whatever you wanted, but you messed with the wrong forensic auditor. As your primary creditor, I am officially liquidating your firm tomorrow morning." I turned my back on Bradley and faced my parents. Desmond and Vivian looked absolutely broken. The wealthy church members were openly glaring at them. Pastor Evans signaled the ushers, who immediately stepped forward to escort my entire family and Bradley out of the sanctuary. The sheer humiliation of being physically removed from Greater Zion Fellowship, the epicenter of their fake elite status, was absolute poetry. Jada shrieked as an usher firmly guided her toward the heavy wooden doors. They were leaving with absolutely nothing, their reputations utterly destroyed. I gathered my leather briefcase from the pulpit and walked out of a side door, feeling the cool, refreshing autumn air hit my face. I had secured my grandfather's legacy and neutralized the threat. I spent the next 3 days working closely with my corporate attorneys, systematically dismantling Bradley's fraudulent empire piece by piece. My parents retreated to a cheap rented condo, too ashamed to show their faces in Harlem. But delusional arrogance is a very difficult disease to cure. On Thursday evening, I was sitting in my newly restored parlor room, reviewing the liquidation documents, when my phone buzzed with a social media notification. I opened the application and could not believe my eyes. Jada had just posted a perfectly curated video online showing off her massive diamond ring and holding a glass of champagne. She was smiling brightly, completely ignoring the absolute financial devastation surrounding her. The caption made my blood boil all over again. "Despite the jealous haters trying to ruin our joy, Bradley and I are moving forward. Join us this Saturday for our lavish $1 million engagement gala. Only the true elite are invited to celebrate our perfect love." I stared at my phone, reading Jada's ridiculous caption. Bradley was bankrupt, his development firm swallowed by my holding company, and my parents were facing financial ruin. Yet they chose to double down on their fake elite status, using stolen funds to prove they were untouchable. I placed my phone face down. If they wanted to throw a lavish party for the true elite, I was going to make sure the primary creditor was properly represented on the guest list. The engagement gala was scheduled for Saturday night at the Grand Sterling Ballroom, an exclusive historic venue in downtown Manhattan. It required a $50,000 deposit just to reserve the space. I spent the next 48 hours working alongside my corporate attorneys. Bradley had a terrible habit of using his business accounts to secure personal luxury rentals. When my auditing software flagged the corporate account he used to book the ballroom, I realized he had handed me the ultimate master key to his own grand execution. Saturday evening arrived with a biting winter chill. I stepped out of my black town car wearing a tailored emerald green gown that commanded absolute authority. I walked up the marble steps of the Grand Sterling Ballroom, the heavy glass doors swinging open as the valet staff bowed respectfully. The Grand Ballroom was a breathtaking spectacle of imported white orchids, towering crystal chandeliers, and hundreds of affluent guests draped in diamonds and custom tuxedos. Waiters in uniforms circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with premium champagne. It was a desperate illusion built entirely on federal wire fraud. I walked confidently through the sea of socialites and real estate moguls. My parents, Desmond and Vivian, were holding court near the center of the room. They were aggressively mingling with Bradley's wealthy white relatives, laughing loudly and pretending their lives were not collapsing under federal investigation. Jada was standing on a slightly elevated platform nearby, showing off her massive diamond ring to envious bridesmaids. She was wearing a silk dress that cost more than my parents' remaining retirement funds. I walked directly toward the center of the room, my heels clicking. My mother saw me first. The fake aristocratic smile vanished from her face. She dropped her champagne flute, the crystal shattering loudly against the floor. Desmond spun around, his jaw dropping in horror as he locked eyes with me. Jada stopped mid-sentence, her hand freezing in the air. The small circle of guests around them backed away, sensing the sudden suffocating tension radiating from our family. Desmond marched directly toward me, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. He grabbed my arm, squeezing it very tight. "What do you think you are doing here?" Desmond hissed, his voice a low, terrified growl. "You were not invited, Sienna. You have already ruined enough of our lives. Turn around and walk out those doors before I physically throw you out myself." I calmly looked down at his hand gripping my arm, then looked back up into his desperate eyes. I easily pulled my arm out of his grasp, smoothing the fabric of my green gown. "You are hosting a $1 million party using money you stole from my historic brownstone." "Dad," I replied, my voice carrying clearly over the soft-playing classical music. "I am the primary creditor of your future son-in-law's bankrupt empire. It would be incredibly rude of me not to attend." Bradley pushed his way through the crowd, stepping aggressively in front of my father. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his height and white privilege to intimidate me in front of his wealthy family members. "Listen to me very carefully, Sienna," Bradley demanded, pointing a finger directly at my face. "I do not care what kind of corporate takeover you think you pulled off. This is my private event. I rented this ballroom. I paid for this security. You do not belong here. You are nothing but a glorified accountant who got lucky." Jada rushed over to stand beside him, her face flushed with fury. "Get out of my party, Sienna!" Jada screamed, no longer caring who heard her. "You are just jealous that I am marrying into a prominent family while you die alone in a dusty basement. Security. Somebody please get security over here right now. We have a hostile trespasser." Bradley snapped his fingers loudly in the air, signaling the two massive, heavily armed security guards standing near the ballroom entrance. "Officers, remove this woman immediately." Bradley barked, his voice dripping with absolute entitlement. "She is trespassing on a private closed event. Drag her out to the curb." The two heavily armed security guards walked briskly across the marble floor. Desmond and Vivian crossed their arms, a brief flash of triumphant relief washing over their faces. They actually believed Bradley's money and privilege could simply erase my presence. The guards stopped right behind Bradley. They did not reach for my arms. They did not pull out their radios. The lead guard, a tall man named Marcus, simply crossed his arms behind his back and looked directly at Bradley with a completely blank expression. Bradley quickly turned around, his face twisting in absolute furious confusion. "What exactly is wrong with you?" Bradley shouted. "I said grab her and throw her out." The lead guard did not move a muscle toward me. Instead, he offered a respectful nod. I smiled warmly at the guard before turning my attention back to my bewildered brother-in-law. "They are not going to throw me out, Bradley," I said, stepping closer to him so he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "You booked this ballroom using a corporate account that my equity firm froze 48 hours ago. Your final payment bounced. So, yesterday afternoon, I used my grandfather's trust to officially purchase the Grand Sterling Ballroom outright. These security guards do not work for you. They work directly for me." The gravity of my words hung in the air, paralyzing everyone standing within earshot. Bradley took a stumbling step backward, his hair looking slightly disheveled as the realization hit him. The Grand Sterling Ballroom was no longer his playground. It was my fortress. I looked at Marcus, my head of security, and gave him a single nod. Marcus immediately signaled his security team through his earpiece. Within seconds, 10 more trained guards materialized from the shadows. They did not move toward me. They formed a tight perimeter around my parents, my sister Jada, and Bradley. The wealthy socialites and elite moguls who had been sipping champagne suddenly began backing away, whispering frantically as they rushed toward the coat check. "Marcus, please clear the main ballroom," I instructed, my voice echoing clearly through the massive space. "Let the guests know the engagement gala has been permanently canceled due to severe financial insolvency." Then escort my family and the groom to be into the private VIP lounge. We have some corporate business to discuss. You cannot do this to me! Jada shrieked, her voice cracking as a security guard firmly guided her away from the center of the room. This is my special night. You are ruining my life. I did not bother responding to her childish tantrum. I simply turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP lounge at the back of the venue. Desmond and Vivian followed, dragged by the security team, their faces pale with absolute terror. Bradley marched behind them, his jaw clenched, trying desperately to maintain his arrogant privilege, but his shaking hands betrayed his mounting panic. Once all 5 of us were inside the plush room, Marcus stepped out and pulled the heavy doors shut. The metallic click of the deadbolt locking us in echoed loudly. "You have lost your mind, Sienna, my father," Desmond snarled, pacing the length of the Persian rug. "You think buying a building gives you the right to hold us hostage? I am still your father. I demand you unlock that door right now." "You stopped being my father the moment you forged my signature to steal my brownstone," I replied, walking over to the media console at the front of the room. "You are not a hostage, Dad. You are a debtor attending a mandatory financial review. Sit down." Vivian collapsed onto a tufted leather sofa, burying her face in her hands. Jada stood next to Bradley, clutching his arm as if he could somehow magically transport them back to their fake reality. I pulled my specialized tablet from my emerald green clutch and connected it to the room's high-definition projector system. The massive flat-screen television on the wall flickered to life. Instead of displaying the romantic curated engagement photos Jada had planned, the screen illuminated the dark room with a massive, incredibly detailed financial spreadsheet. "Welcome to your actual reality," I announced, stepping aside so everyone had a clear view of the glaring red numbers on the screen. As the silent majority shareholder of Vanguard Equity Partners, I now own every single piece of commercial debt attached to Bradley's development firm. And as a forensic auditor, I spent the last 3 days tracing every single dime you people stole to fund this pathetic illusion. Bradley swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically across the projected bank statements. "Those records are private corporate property," he stammered, his voice lacking all its previous authority. "You have no legal right to display them." "I own your company, Bradley," I reminded him coldly. "That makes them my records, and they tell a fascinating story." I swiped my tablet, highlighting a specific column of fraudulent wire transfers. "Let us look at your elite status, Jada. The $50,000 deposit for this ballroom tonight, paid for using funds illegally diverted from your father's contracting business. Your massive diamond engagement ring, financed through a shell company. Bradley set up, using the $5 million fraudulent mortgage he took out on my grandfather's brownstone." Jada let out a strangled gasp, dropping Bradley's arm as if he had burned her. She stared at the screen, her eyes wide with horror as she finally comprehended the numbers. "Bradley, what is she talking about?" Jada demanded, her voice rising in panic. "You told me your firm just closed a $50 million deal in Brooklyn. You told me we were moving to a penthouse. Your fiancé is completely bankrupt, Jada," I stated, delivering the crushing truth without a single ounce of pity. "His firm is $18 million in debt. He has been laundering money through our parents' church building fund to hide his insolvency from federal regulators. He does not have a penthouse. He does not even own the expensive suit he is wearing tonight. He used our parents' desperate need for social validation to bleed their retirement accounts dry, and then he convinced them to steal my house just to keep himself out of federal prison." "You are lying!" Jada screamed, turning to face Bradley with tears streaming down her face. "Tell me she is lying, Bradley. Tell me we are still wealthy." Bradley could not even look at her. He stared at the floor, his entire arrogant facade crumbling under the weight of undeniable documented evidence. Vivian began to sob openly on the leather sofa, rocking back and forth as the reality of her ruined social standing in the Harlem elite circles finally settled in. Desmond stood frozen, his chest heaving as he realized his life was completely over. "You played a very dangerous game, Bradley," I said, walking slowly toward him. "You thought you could walk into a prominent African-American family, use your perceived status to blind my greedy parents and strip us of our generational wealth entirely. But you left a massive digital paper trail, and I followed every single crumb. I am handing this entire presentation over to the FBI tomorrow morning. Bradley's head snapped up. His eyes were wild, filled with the desperate cornered panic of a man facing decades in a strict federal penitentiary. He looked at me, then turned his frantic gaze toward my father. He raised a violently shaking finger and pointed it directly at Desmond's chest. "It was not my idea," Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "I did not mastermind the embezzlement scheme. I did not forge the conservatorship or the brownstone mortgage. Desmond did. Your father came to me when his contracting business went under. He orchestrated the entire fraud to save himself from total bankruptcy." Desmond lunged forward, his hands curled into tight fists. He completely abandoned his dignified church deacon persona, looking more like a cornered animal ready to tear apart its own ally. "You lying, pathetic coward!" Desmond roared, spit flying from his lips as he pointed directly at Bradley. "You came to me whining about your failing developments. You begged for a cash infusion to keep your wealthy investors from realizing you were a complete fraud. I only gave you access to the brownstone equity because you promised to double the return in 6 months. You forged your own daughter's medical records to get that equity," Bradley screamed back, his face bright red and veins bulging. "Do not stand there and act like a victim, Desmond. You are the one who hired the fake notary. You set up the offshore routing. I just gave you the destination accounts. When the federal agents ask questions tomorrow morning, I am telling them exactly who drafted the conservatorship. I am cooperating fully to save myself." Jada let out a sound that was half gasp and half shriek. She stepped between them, pushing her hands against Bradley's chest. Her eyes darted frantically between her father and her fiancé. "What are you two saying right now, Bradley? Look at me. Look at me right now." Jada grabbed the lapels of his expensive suit jacket, her voice trembling violently. "Tell me you still have the money. Tell me this is just a temporary cash flow problem. We have a deposit on the penthouse in Tribeca. We are supposed to be flying to Paris for our honeymoon." Bradley looked down at Jada, the final shreds of his elite arrogance melting away into pure, unfiltered panic. He practically peeled her hands off his jacket, stepping backward as if she were suddenly a liability. "There is no penthouse, Jada." Bradley snapped, his voice bitter and exhausted. "There is no Paris. The money is gone. I used the last of the mortgage funds to pay off the caterers and the florists for this stupid engagement party. Your sister just bought my entire mountain of debt for pennies on the dollar. I do not even own the car we drove here in tonight." Jada staggered backward, her high heels catching on the thick Persian rug. She looked at her massive diamond ring, then looked at me standing calmly by the projector screen. The absolute reality of her situation finally shattered her perfect, curated delusion. She was not marrying into elite wealth. She was marrying a broke, desperate criminal who had just thrown her own father to the federal authorities. "You used me," Jada cried, staring at Bradley with profound disgust. "You only proposed to me because you knew my father had access to a historic Harlem property. You needed collateral to save your own miserable life. And you only loved me because you thought I was a billionaire." Bradley fired back viciously, completely dropping his polished gentleman facade. "Do not act like a martyr, Jada. You loved the country club memberships and the designer dresses. You never once asked how I was paying for them. We used each other and we both lost. I watched them tear each other to shreds, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical satisfaction. They were doing the work for me. They had built their entire alliance on greed, fake status, and a mutual willingness to destroy me for their own benefit. Now, under the glaring light of hard financial evidence, they were cannibalizing one another to survive. This is highly entertaining, but it changes absolutely nothing," I interrupted, projecting my voice clearly over their vicious argument. "It does not matter who masterminded the embezzlement scheme. You both signed the wire transfers. You both leveraged stolen property. You are both equally liable for the $18 million missing from the escrow accounts. The federal investigators will gladly lock both of you in adjacent cells." Desmond turned his furious gaze back toward me. He took a heavy step forward, but the thick wooden door of the VIP lounge rattled loudly, reminding him that my security team was standing right outside. He stopped, his shoulders slumping as the fight finally drained out of him. He looked like a hollow, broken old man who had just watched his entire legacy evaporate into thin air. Sienna, please. Desmond pleaded, his voice suddenly dropping to a pathetic, shaking whisper. I am your father. I raised you. I gave you everything I had. If you hand those files over to the FBI, I will die in prison. You have the money now. You have the power. You own his firm. You can just quietly delete the wire logs. You can make this go away without destroying the family name. You destroyed the family name the day you handed me a fake eviction notice on Christmas morning, I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of empathy. You tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward to cover your own financial incompetence. I am not deleting a single line of code. You are going to face the exact consequences you tried to force on me. Vivian had been sitting silently on the leather sofa, her face buried in her hands. Suddenly she stood up. She smoothed the wrinkles out of her designer dress and lifted her chin, wiping the tears from her face. Her expression shifted from absolute despair to a cold, calculated desperation. She reached into her expensive clutch purse and pulled out a folded piece of yellowed parchment paper. You are not giving anything to the FBI, Sienna, Vivian said, her voice surprisingly steady as she unfolded the paper and held it up. And you do not own that brownstone or the trust fund or Bradley's corporate debt. I narrowed my eyes, looking at the document in her shaking hands. What are you talking about, Mom? Vivian smiled, a twisted, desperate look crossing her face. This is a newly discovered handwritten will from your grandfather. I stared at the wrinkled piece of paper trembling in Vivian's hands. The sheer desperation radiating from her was almost pathetic. She held the yellowed parchment like a magic shield to deflect the federal fraud charges bearing down on her husband. I took a slow step forward, scanning the text. Even from that distance, the forgery was laughably amateurish. My grandfather had pristine architectural handwriting. The ink on that page was erratic, the loops exaggerated, and the signature looked like it had been traced by a terrified child. But in the eyes of the law, any document claiming to be a last will automatically trigger a mandatory probate review. Vivian knew exactly what she was doing. She only needed it to cause a legal delay. You actually forged a will, I said, shaking my head in absolute disbelief. You are already facing decades in federal prison for the fraudulent conservatorship and the commercial mortgage. Now you are adding estate fraud to the list. It is not a forgery, Vivian shrieked, clutching the paper tightly against her chest. Desmond found it tucked inside your grandfather's old Bible yesterday morning. It explicitly revokes your access to the trust and names your father as the sole beneficiary of all intellectual property and liquid assets. The moment my lawyer files this with the surrogate court on Monday morning, your access to Vanguard Equity Partners will be completely suspended. Bradley's eyes lit up with a sudden vicious realization. The panic suffocating him was instantly replaced by toxic arrogance. If my access to the trust was frozen, my hostile takeover of his company would be temporarily halted. The massive debt recall I had initiated would be stuck in legal limbo. He smoothed his tailored suit, looking at my parents. You heard her, Sienna, Bradley sneered, a triumphant grin spreading across his pale face. Your little corporate coup is over. The funds are locked. You cannot liquidate my firm, and you certainly cannot kick me out of this venue. I still own the building, Bradley, I reminded him coldly. Marcus, escort these trespassers out the back service exit. Make sure they take the garbage alley route. My security team moved in, grabbing Desmond and Bradley by the arms. Jada wailed loudly as they were physically forced out of the VIP lounge. I watched the heavy mahogany doors close, but the cold knot in my stomach refused to untangle. Vivian's desperate play was a major complication. By Monday afternoon, my corporate attorneys confirmed my worst fears. The surrogate court issued a temporary freeze on all trust expenditures until the authenticity of the newly discovered will could be verified. My multi-million-dollar war chest was completely locked down. I could not move a single dime. Bradley did not waste a single second. He knew his development firm was bleeding cash, and he needed a massive public distraction to keep his investors from pulling their capital. He decided to leverage his white privilege and elite social network. By Wednesday morning, my phone started buzzing relentlessly. Marcus called me at 6 o'clock, instructing me to turn on the local news immediately. I grabbed the remote and switched on the television. My face was plastered across the screen, right next to a professional headshot of Bradley looking like an upstanding businessman. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the broadcast made my blood boil. It read, "Prominent developer targeted in elaborate extortion scam by unstable relative." I turned up the volume, listening in sheer horror as a news anchor detailed a fabricated story provided directly by Bradley's public relations team. Bradley released a statement claiming that I was a deranged, jealous sister-in-law who had suffered a severe mental breakdown. He told the press that I had fabricated complex financial documents to extort millions of dollars from his reputable development firm. He flipped the narrative, painting himself as the innocent visionary, trying to protect his traumatized fiancée from her aggressive scam artist sister. The media eagerly swallowed the story whole. It was the perfect scandalous headline. A successful, prominent white developer being terrorized by a bitter, unstable black woman trying to steal his hard-earned wealth. They aired interview clips of Jada crying outside her rented condo, telling reporters that she feared for her physical safety. They showed Desmond giving a solemn statement, publicly apologizing for his daughter's psychotic behavior and confirming that the family was seeking urgent psychiatric intervention for me. They weaponized my own race and gender against me, relying on harmful social stereotypes to completely discredit my professional reputation. My phone was blowing up with text messages from industry contacts and nosy neighbors. The relentless media smear campaign was a calculated, devastating strike. Bradley knew that without access to my trust fund, I could not immediately finance a massive defamation lawsuit to shut down the press. He was buying himself time to hide his embezzled millions, while the city tore my character to absolute shreds. I sat on my velvet sofa, taking deep breaths to steady my racing heart. I had to remain entirely objective. I was a forensic auditor. I dealt in facts, not emotions. I reached for my laptop to draft a counterstatement with Marcus, but my phone rang loudly. The caller identification displayed the name of my boss, the senior managing partner at the prestigious auditing firm, where I had worked tirelessly for 8 years. I answered the call, forcing a professional, steady tone. He did not exchange any pleasantries. His voice was stiff and distant. He informed me that the firm's board of directors had held an emergency meeting that morning regarding the explosive news coverage. He said that client trust was the absolute foundation of their financial services, and my publicized extortion scandal was a catastrophic liability. Before I could present my evidence or explain the forged documents, he delivered the crushing blow. My keycard was deactivated, my corporate accounts were suspended, and I was officially placed on indefinite administrative leave. I lowered the phone from my ear and stared at the dark screen. The dial tone echoed in the quiet of my grandfather's parlor. My managing partner had not even given me the chance to defend myself. In the span of a 10-minute phone call, my pristine 8-year career at the auditing firm had been completely suspended. Bradley and my parents had successfully weaponized the media, using harmful stereotypes to paint me as an unhinged, dangerous woman, effectively stripping away my professional credibility. They thought cutting me off from my corporate resources and freezing my trust fund would leave me entirely defenseless. They expected me to break down, panic, and beg for a settlement. But they forgot that my greatest asset was never my job title or the balance in my bank account. My greatest asset was my mind. I stood up from the velvet sofa and walked toward the grand staircase. If the surrogate court was going to freeze my liquid assets over a forged piece of parchment, I needed physical, undeniable proof that predated their fabricated timeline. My grandfather was a man who survived the civil rights movement and built his wealth in an era when black men were routinely denied bank loans. He never trusted digital systems entirely. He always said that pixels could be manipulated, but ink on paper carried the weight of truth. I walked down the hallway to the master bedroom and opened the door to his heavy walk-in closet. I pushed aside the racks of his vintage suits and knelt on the hardwood floor. At the very back of the closet sat a massive brass-bound cedar trunk. I had not opened it since he passed away, preserving it out of a deep sense of grief. Today, however, sentimentality was a luxury I could not afford. I unclasped the heavy brass latches and pushed the heavy wooden lid open. The smell of cedar and old pipe tobacco instantly filled the air. I carefully sifted through the top layers. There were old photographs, church bulletins, and neatly folded sweaters. I dug deeper, running my hands along the wooden panels of the trunk. My fingers caught on a slight, almost imperceptible groove near the bottom right corner. I pressed down firmly, and a hidden wooden panel popped up with a soft click. Inside the concealed compartment lay a thick black leather ledger wrapped in a protective plastic sleeve. I pulled it out and carried it over to the mahogany desk near the window. My hands were remarkably steady as I untied the leather strap binding the book. I opened to the first page. It was not a diary or a collection of memories. It was a meticulous handwritten financial log dating back over 20 years. My grandfather had recorded every single transaction, loan, and business deal he had ever made. I slowly turned the crisp pages, my eye through the book. The handwriting changed slightly, becoming more urgent. I read the entries and felt a cold, sharp shock radiate through my chest. This was not just a record of my grandfather's wealth. It was a detailed, documented history of my father's financial crimes. 20 years ago, Desmond had attempted to embezzle money from my grandfather's contracting business to fund his own failed ventures. My grandfather had caught him. Instead of sending his own son to prison, he forced Desmond to sign a legally binding confession and a repayment agreement. I stared at the original blue ink signature of my father at the bottom of the page. Right next to it was the official stamp of a state notary. I flipped the page and found even more damning evidence. There were original bank receipts showing how Desmond had routinely siphoned money from the church building fund decades ago. Schemes my grandfather had quietly paid out of his own pocket to cover up and protect our family name. The ledger detailed a relentless, pathological history of Desmond committing corporate fraud, stealing assets, and forging signatures. My grandfather had kept all the receipts. He knew Desmond would eventually try to steal my inheritance, so he left me the ultimate undeniable character witness. This ledger was the silver bullet. In a probate court, a history of documented, admitted financial fraud and forgery completely destroys the credibility of anyone presenting a newly discovered will. Vivian's fake parchment was entirely useless against decades of notarized confessions. I immediately took out my phone and took high-resolution photographs of every single page, uploading them directly to my secure encrypted cloud server. I then dialed Marcus, my lead corporate attorney. I told him I had just found the exact weapon we needed to lift the freeze on my trust fund and destroy the fake will in front of the judge. Before Marcus could even process the good news, my secondary computer monitor lit up with a blaring red notification. I had installed an aggressive automated tracking program on all of the corporate accounts associated with Bradley's firm before the court froze my trust. I dropped my phone on the desk and rushed over to the monitor, my eyes darting across the scrolling lines of code. The system had just flagged a massive unauthorized wire transfer attempt. "Marcus, hold on," I said, picking the phone back up, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Bradley is making a move." "Sienna, what is happening?" Marcus asked, the legal excitement in his voice instantly shifting to serious concern. I analyzed the routing numbers flashing across my screen. The transfer was not coming from his frozen development accounts. It was originating from a private offshore escrow account that had been untouched for months. It was the account holding Jada's multi-million-dollar wedding fund, the money Bradley had stolen from my brownstone mortgage to supposedly pay for their lavish lifestyle. Bradley realizes the media stunt is only a temporary distraction. I told Marcus, my fingers flying across my keyboard as I traced the digital destination of the funds. He knows the federal investigators are closing in on his actual firm. He is completely liquidating Jada's wedding fund. "Where is he sending the money?" Marcus demanded. I watched the geographical ping register on my tracking software. He is routing it to an untraceable bank account in the Cayman Islands. And Marcus, the IP address initiating the transfer is not located at his rented condo. I zoomed in on the tracking map, my blood turning to ice. The transfer is being initiated using the public wireless network at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Bradley is trying to flee the country right now. I commanded Marcus to call the Port Authority police immediately. I knew that waiting for law enforcement to navigate bureaucratic red tape would take hours. Bradley only needed 90 seconds for the offshore wire transfer to clear the international banking protocols. If that money hit the Cayman Islands, it would vanish into a maze of untraceable shell corporations, and he would disappear right along with it. I could not rely on the authorities to stop him. I had to kill the transaction myself. I opened a secure terminal on my computer and accessed the back-end clearinghouse network used by Vanguard Equity Partners. Because I was now the majority shareholder of the firm holding Bradley's debt, I had highest-level administrative clearance over his linked escrow accounts. I watched the progress bar on my screen slowly filling up as Bradley's transfer requested authorization from the global banking network. He was trying to move $4 million. That was the entirety of Jada's wedding fund, combined with the last remaining scraps of my parents' liquidated retirement accounts. He was abandoning his bride and stealing every last dime her family had to their name. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I bypassed the standard authorization queues and executed a hard freeze on the specific routing numbers Bradley was using. I then initiated a unilateral clawback protocol, a forensic mechanism designed to instantly recall funds flagged for active federal fraud. The progress bar on the unauthorized transfer halted at 98%. A red warning banner flashed across my screen. The transaction was denied. The $4 million was ripped out of cyberspace and forcefully deposited directly into a secure holding account under my absolute control. I picked up my smartphone and dialed Bradley's personal cell number. I knew he was standing at the terminal, staring at his banking application, desperately waiting for the confirmation receipt. He answered on the second ring, his breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. "Listen to me, you idiot!" Bradley hissed into the phone, clearly thinking he was speaking to his offshore financial broker. "The transfer just failed. You need to push it through right now. My flight is boarding in 5 minutes. "I am afraid your broker cannot help you today, Bradley," I said, leaning back in my grandfather's leather desk chair. "And neither can your boarding pass. I just seized the $4 million you tried to wire to the Caymans." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute perfection. I could practically hear his heart stop beating. "Sienna." Bradley choked out, his voice cracking with pure terror. "Give me that money back. You do not understand what you are doing." "I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice calm and razor-sharp. "You convinced Jada to rush an intimate wedding ceremony this morning to distract her while you drained her accounts at the airport. You were going to leave her standing in her designer dress, with absolutely nothing. But now you are the one with nothing. Furthermore, my corporate attorneys just notified the Transportation Security Administration that your passport is linked to an active federal embezzlement investigation. If you try to board that plane, you will be arrested on the tarmac." "You are a monster," Bradley whispered, his voice trembling violently. "No, Bradley, I am a forensic auditor," I corrected him. "Run." I hung up the phone. Through the tracking software, I watched his phone signal move erratically through the airport terminal. He did not go to his gate. He bolted toward the ground transportation exits, abandoning his luggage and fleeing into the city like a desperate fugitive. Meanwhile, completely unaware of the digital financial bloodbath that had just occurred, Jada was standing in the grand vestibule of an exclusive Manhattan church. My parents had scrambled to pull together a rushed, heavily publicized ceremony, desperate to secure the marriage and the supposed billionaire wealth before their social standing collapsed completely. Jada was wearing a custom silk wedding gown that cost more than my first car. She was pacing the marble floor, her bridesmaids looking increasingly uncomfortable as the clock ticked 30 minutes past the scheduled start time. I dialed Jada's number. She answered immediately, her voice shrill and frantic. "Bradley, where are you?" Jada demanded. "The string quartet has been playing the same song for 20 minutes. Mom is having a panic attack in the front pew." "Bradley is not coming, Jada," I stated flatly. "Sienna," Jada shrieked, her tone shifting from panic to sheer outrage. "Why are you calling me? Are you seriously trying to ruin my wedding day?" "Your groom just tried to board a one-way flight to the Cayman Islands," I explained, refusing to let her interrupt me. "He was at John F. Kennedy International Airport, trying to wire your entire $4 million wedding fund into an offshore shell account. He was abandoning you at the altar and stealing every dime Mom and Dad had left. I froze the transfer and took the money back. Bradley is currently running from federal authorities. Jada let out a strangled, breathless noise. The phone slipped from her hand, the microphone picking up the clattering sound as it hit the marble floor. I could hear her screams echoing through the grand vestibule, a chaotic chorus of absolute despair as her bridesmaids rushed to her side. Her billionaire fantasy was officially dead. I ended the call and set my phone down on the mahogany desk. I had the money, I had my grandfather's hidden ledger, and the man who tried to destroy my family legacy was running for his life. The war felt won. I stood up to pour myself a glass of water, finally letting out a long, exhausted sigh of relief. Suddenly, a sharp, aggressive knock echoed from the heavy oak front doors of the brownstone. I walked down the hallway, glancing through the security monitor. A man in a plain gray suit was standing on the porch holding a thick stack of manila envelopes. I opened the door cautiously. "Sienna Hayes," the man asked. "Yes," I replied. "You have been served," he said, pressing the heavy stack of documents into my hands before turning around and walking quickly down the steps. I closed the door and looked down at the paperwork. The official seal of the New York State Supreme Court glared back at me. I flipped to the first page, my eyes scanning the bold black text. My parents, Desmond and Vivian Hayes, were suing me. They were seeking $50 million in civil damages, citing extreme defamation of character, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and tortious interference with a business contract. They claimed that my public outburst at the church and my hostile corporate takeover were fabricated acts of malice designed to ruin their pristine reputations and destroy their daughter's marriage. I could not help but laugh out loud. The sheer blinding arrogance of Desmond and Vivian was truly breathtaking. They were entirely bankrupt, publicly humiliated, and tied to a fleeing felon. Yet they still believed they could use the legal system to bully me into submission. They thought filing a massive lawsuit would force me to negotiate a quiet settlement and hand over my grandfather's trust to make the media scandal disappear. They had no idea that by suing me, they had just handed me the legal right to depose them under oath. They had just invited me to bring my grandfather's hidden handwritten ledger directly into a court of law. They wanted a legal battle, and I was going to give them a complete massacre. The heavy mahogany conference table in Marcus's midtown law firm felt exactly like a battlefield. Outside, freezing rain threatened, but the temperature inside the room was already sub-zero. I sat next to Marcus, staring down at my folded hands in absolute silence. Across the vast expanse of polished wood sat the people who used to be my former family. Desmond wore his tailored suit, projecting the absolute arrogance of a church deacon who believed he was untouchable. Vivian sat rigidly beside him, clutching a handbag purchased with funds stolen from my grandfather's legacy. Jada glared at me with pure, unadulterated venom. Her multi-million-dollar wedding collapsed weeks ago, yet she still acted like the victim. Beside her sat Bradley. He looked haggard. Since I froze his offshore transfer, he had been trapped in the city, stripped of his developer facade and drowning in debt. Their defense attorney Harrison organized his thick files with a smug smile. They were suing me for $50 million. They genuinely thought this deposition was their victory lap. They believed their lawsuit would force me to surrender Vanguard Equity Partners and hand over my grandfather's trust just to make the legal nightmare disappear. I kept my shoulders slumped and my eyes downcast. I needed them to think I was entirely broken. As a forensic auditor, I knew that arrogant people make the most catastrophic mistakes when they believe they have already won. A court stenographer sat at the end of the table, ready to record every single word. Marcus adjusted his glasses and nodded. The deposition officially began. Harrison started by questioning my father. Desmond leaned back, inflating with self-importance. Under oath, my father spun a magnificent web of lies. He confidently stated that my grandfather had always intended for him to own the Harlem brownstone. He claimed I was a deeply disturbed, unstable daughter who had begged to live in his basement. He testified that the $5 million commercial mortgage was a legitimate business loan he took out to help Bradley develop community housing. Marcus did not object. He simply asked polite, clarifying questions, encouraging Desmond to add more specific details. My father eagerly took the bait. He explicitly swore that the medical conservatorship was authentic, claiming 3 different doctors had evaluated my declining mental state. Vivian took her turn next. She placed a hand over her heart, performing her best Sunday routine. She testified under penalty of perjury that I had violently attacked her at the church, screaming fabricated financial numbers just to humiliate them in front of their congregation. She wept dry tears, stating my actions had caused severe emotional distress and ruined their sterling reputation. I sank lower into my chair, letting out a heavy, defeated sigh. Vivian glanced at me, a triumphant sneer crossing her face. She truly believed her performance was flawless. She did not realize that Marcus was laying down digital tripwires, locking her into sworn statements that contradicted the financial records sitting in my secure server. Then it was Bradley's turn to speak. He straightened his tie, trying to project the image of a successful developer targeted by a scam artist. Bradley swore under oath that his company was entirely solvent. He claimed the $18 million debt I purchased was a minor administrative error. He testified that my hostile corporate takeover was illegal and that I had hacked into his private bank accounts at the airport out of sheer malice. Jada aggressively backed up his story. She testified that I was insanely jealous of her elite status and beautiful wedding. She swore that I had fabricated the offshore money laundering scheme just to leave her stranded at the altar. Marcus let them speak for 2 grueling hours. He let them build a massive, inescapable fortress of perjury. Every single lie was typed into the official legal record by the diligent court stenographer. When Bradley finally finished his grand fabricated tale of extortion, Harrison folded his hands and smiled across the table. "I believe my clients have made the reality of this situation perfectly clear," Harrison said with supreme arrogance. "Sienna Hayes orchestrated a malicious coordinated attack on this family. We are willing to discuss a quiet settlement today if you surrender control of Vanguard Equity Partners and relinquish the brownstone. Otherwise, we will destroy you in front of a jury." Marcus did not look intimidated. He calmly opened his black leather briefcase and pulled out a single clear plastic sleeve. Inside the sleeve rested the yellowed parchment paper my mother had dramatically produced at the engagement gala. It was the newly discovered will. "Before we discuss any settlements, I have a few questions regarding this document," Marcus said, sliding the plastic sleeve across the polished wood. "Desmond, you submitted this as your father's final binding will. You swore under oath that you found it hidden in his old Bible." "That is absolutely correct," Desmond replied proudly. "It revokes Sienna's trust entirely." "And you claim this signature belongs to a licensed state notary named Arthur Jenkins?" Marcus asked, pointing to the blue ink stamp at the bottom of the page. "Yes," Vivian quickly interjected. "He was a respected friend of the family. He notarized it years ago." I finally lifted my head. I sat up straight, dropping the defeated posture entirely. I looked my parents dead in the eye and smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. Marcus walked over to the heavy conference room doors and pulled them open. A tall, nervous-looking man wearing a cheap gray suit stepped inside. Desmond and Vivian immediately froze. The color drained completely from their faces. "For the official record," I said, my voice echoing through the silent room, "this man is not Arthur Jenkins. His name is Gregory Vance. He is a struggling community theater actor. And yesterday afternoon, he gladly signed a sworn affidavit admitting that my father paid him $2,000 to buy a fake notary stamp online and forge that signature." Harrison dropped his pen. The defense attorney stared at Gregory Vance, then looked at Desmond and Vivian with absolute disgust. Harrison did not utter a single word in defense of his clients. He simply snapped his briefcase shut, stood up, and formally announced his immediate withdrawal as their legal counsel. The $50 million defamation lawsuit completely evaporated right there in the conference room. However, the legal war was not entirely over. Because Vivian had officially filed the forged parchment with the surrogate court, a formal trial was mandated to definitively invalidate the fake will and address the massive embezzlement scheme attached to my historic brownstone. 3 weeks later, we stepped into the imposing courtroom of the New York State Supreme Court. Stripped of their elite status and completely out of money, my parents and Bradley had been forced to hire a discount defense attorney. The gallery was packed with reporters. The media narrative had completely flipped since I leaked the truth about Bradley's frozen offshore accounts. Jada sat in the front row looking entirely defeated in a cheap dress. Marcus called Bradley to the witness stand. Bradley adjusted his tie as he walked up, desperately trying to project the image of an untouchable developer. He swore to tell the truth. Bradley believed his inherent privilege would shield him. Marcus approached the podium holding a thick black folder. "Bradley," Marcus began, his voice projecting clearly across the silent courtroom, "you have consistently claimed that you had absolutely no knowledge of the fraudulent medical conservatorship. You testified that the $5 million transferred into your corporate accounts was a standard legitimate business loan provided by your future father-in-law. Is that correct?" "Yes," Bradley answered, lifting his chin arrogantly. "Desmond offered to invest in my firm. I am a visionary developer. I do not concern myself with where my investors source their capital." "A visionary developer," Marcus repeated, allowing a sharp, mocking tone to enter his voice. "Let us look at your visionary financial practices." Marcus walked over to the evidence projector and displayed a series of bank statements on the massive screen behind the judge. "These documents show that exactly 12 minutes after Desmond fraudulently mortgaged my client's brownstone, your company received the $5 million. But you did not use it for development, did you, Bradley?" "I used the funds for corporate restructuring," Bradley countered, his arrogant facade slipping slightly as he shifted uncomfortably in the wooden witness chair. "You used the funds to pay off your massive personal debts, and then you attempted to launder the remainder through the Greater Zion Fellowship Building Fund," Marcus stated, slamming a new stack of documents onto the podium. "But let us focus on your actions at John F. Kennedy International Airport. On the morning of your scheduled wedding to Jada Hayes, you attempted to wire $4 million into an untraceable offshore shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. Do you deny this?" Bradley looked at his lawyer, who was frantically flipping through his notes. "That was a planned corporate expansion," Bradley stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "It was legal." "You are under oath, Bradley," Marcus warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying register. "I have the digital footprint of the transfer authorized by your personal security credentials using a public wireless network at Terminal 4. You were fleeing the country. Furthermore, the funds you attempted to wire were the exact same funds stolen from my client's property." The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for nonsense, leaned forward over her bench. "The witness will answer the question directly. Did you attempt to move stolen funds to an offshore account while fleeing the jurisdiction?" Bradley swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the courtroom. He looked at Jada, who was staring at him with pure hatred. He looked at Desmond, who was glaring back with equal venom. Bradley was trapped in a flawless legal corner. If he denied the transfer, Marcus would present the digital logs, and Bradley would be charged with blatant perjury right in front of a Supreme Court judge. If he admitted to the transfer, he was confessing to federal wire fraud. The pressure in the courtroom became absolute, crushing, and completely suffocating. Marcus stepped right up to the witness box. "Bradley, I will remind you that perjury carries a maximum sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Wire fraud carries 20 years. You are staring down a very long, dark future. Did you knowingly receive and attempt to launder $5 million stolen from Sienna Hayes?" Bradley cracked. The pristine elite developer persona shattered into a million pathetic pieces. He gripped the witness stand, his face turning crimson. "I did not steal the house," Bradley screamed, his voice echoing hysterically off the high courtroom ceiling. "It was Desmond. Desmond forged the medical records. Desmond hired the fake notary. He came to me because he was bankrupt and begged me to help him wash the money. Yes, I tried to wire the funds offshore. Yes, I knew it was stolen. But I only did it because Desmond threatened to drag me down with him. He masterminded the entire embezzlement scheme." Pandemonium erupted. Desmond leaped up, shouting furious curses. Vivian wailed loudly, realizing her son-in-law had confessed to a felony and dragged her husband straight to hell. The defense attorney buried his face in his hands. Jada sat frozen, watching her fake elite life end in real time. The judge slammed her gavel repeatedly. "Order in my court!" she bellowed, her face red with fury. The room fell silent. She pointed a shaking finger at Bradley, who was panting in the witness box. You have just admitted to federal wire fraud and money laundering under oath, the judge stated with sheer disgust. She turned to the armed court officers. Bailiff, lock down this courtroom. Nobody leaves. I am officially halting this trial right now, and I am calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom shut with a resounding finalized boom. The bailiff turned the brass deadbolt, sealing everyone inside. The sheer panic radiating from the defense table was palpable. Bradley slumped forward in the witness box, burying his face in his trembling hands as the reality of his sworn confession washed over him. He had just handed the federal government a perfectly wrapped bow, tied admission of guilt. Desmond leaped up from his chair, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. He began shouting at his defense attorney, demanding that the lawyer strike the testimony from the record. The attorney simply shook his head, packing his legal pads into his briefcase and taking 3 steps away from my father. You cannot strike a voluntary confession of federal wire fraud from a sworn Supreme Court record, Marcus whispered to me, leaning back in his chair with a highly satisfied smile. Your father is officially out of moves. I sat still, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to erase my existence. Vivian was hyperventilating in the front row of the gallery, clutching Jada's arm. Jada looked entirely catatonic. Her fake elite world, her millionaire white fiancé, and her unearned social status were all disintegrating right in front of the flashing cameras of the local press. The reporters in the gallery were frantically typing on their phones, sending out breaking news alerts. We waited in suffocating tension for exactly 22 minutes. Then the side doors near the judge's chambers swung open. 4 federal agents wearing dark suits marched into the courtroom. Their badges gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The lead agent, a tall woman with zero tolerance for wealthy entitlement, walked directly up to the bench. She exchanged a few quiet, urgent words with the judge and reviewed the printed transcript the court stenographer handed over. The agent nodded once, then turned her sharp gaze directly toward the witness box. Bradley Harrison, the lead agent announced, her voice cutting through the silent room like a knife. Step down and place your hands behind your back. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and interstate embezzlement. 2 agents moved swiftly, grabbing Bradley by the arms before he could stand up properly. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the silent courtroom was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Bradley looked toward the gallery. Jada, call my parents. Bradley begged, his voice cracking with sheer desperation as the agents pulled him toward the exit. Tell them to wire the bail money, please, Jada. Jada did not even look at him. She turned her face away, disgusted by the broke, handcuffed criminal she almost married. The lead agent did not stop there. She pivoted and walked right up to the defense table where my father was standing. Desmond puffed out his chest, trying to project the authority of a senior church deacon. He adjusted his expensive tie, completely delusional about the power he thought he still held. Officer, there has been a massive misunderstanding, Desmond stated, using his deepest voice. I am a respected business owner in Harlem. This man simply tricked me into a bad investment. I am a victim here. Save it for the federal judge, Desmond Hayes, the agent replied coldly, pulling a second pair of handcuffs from her belt. You are under arrest for aggravated identity theft, real estate fraud, and forging a medical conservatorship to illegally seize assets. Turn around. You cannot arrest me, Desmond shouted, dropping his polished persona as panic finally broke through his arrogance. I am a prominent deacon. I know the mayor. I know the police commissioner. Vivian, call the church elders right now. The agents ignored his frantic shouting. They forcefully spun my father around and locked the steel cuffs securely around his wrists. Vivian let out a piercing scream from the gallery. She rushed forward, grabbing the wooden railing that separated the spectators from the legal floor. She reached toward Desmond as if they were starring in a tragic movie. Desmond, Vivian wailed loudly. What are we going to do? The church is going to see this on the evening news. Our reputation is completely destroyed. Your reputation was destroyed the day you evicted your own daughter on Christmas morning to fund a criminal, I said, packing grandfather's hidden ledger safely back into my leather briefcase. I stood up and walked toward the center aisle, stopping right next to my weeping mother and my completely shell-shocked sister. You gambled my heritage to buy your way into high society, Mom. Now you get to pay the ultimate price. I did not wait for her reply. I walked out of the courtroom with my head high, leaving them surrounded by cameras and federal agents. Vivian and Jada were suddenly left with absolutely nothing. The two men who had funded their lavish fake lifestyle were currently sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their social circles in Harlem had completely blacklisted them. But Vivian and Jada still believed they had one final safety net. After the humiliating scene at the courthouse, they pulled their coats tightly around their shoulders and walked out into the freezing New York rain. They could not even afford to hail a taxi. They marched 6 blocks through the bitter cold, heading straight back to the luxury high-rise condominium Desmond had rented for them after I repossessed the historic brownstone. They shivered as they approached the sleek glass doors of their expensive building. They just wanted to hide inside their lavish apartment and figure out a new manipulation tactic. But as they rounded the corner and looked up at the pristine entrance of their luxury building, they stopped dead in their tracks. Resting right on the wet, dirty curb, soaking in the freezing rain, were dozens of black trash bags, designer clothes, and overturned furniture. Vivian dropped her handbag straight into a deep puddle on the sidewalk. She stared in absolute horror at the mountain of black trash bags piled on the concrete. Her custom-tailored dresses, imported silk sheets, and expensive velvet cushions were completely ruined, soaked by the freezing New York rain. Jada let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She lunged forward desperately, trying to pull a pair of waterlogged designer heels from the top of the garbage heap. The sleek doors of the luxury high-rise swung open. The building manager stepped out, flanked by 2 burly security guards. Vivian immediately marched toward him, her face twisted into a mask of arrogant rage. She angrily threatened to sue the building management for millions. The manager did not even flinch. He calmly held up a legal clipboard blocking her path to the warm lobby. He informed Vivian that the corporate lease on their penthouse was held by Bradley's development firm. Because Vanguard Equity Partners had seized and liquidated the bankrupt firm that morning, the lease was immediately terminated. The primary creditor had ordered an expedited eviction. Vivian gasped, stepping back as if she had been slapped. She finally realized the absolute reach of my corporate takeover. I had not just seized Bradley's construction equipment and bank accounts. I had systematically hunted down every single luxury asset tied to his fraudulent empire and canceled them all. The manager gave them a cold look, stepped back inside the warm lobby, and locked the heavy glass doors right in their faces. The freezing rain turned into sharp, biting sleet. Vivian pulled her soaked cashmere coat tightly around her shoulders, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. She refused to accept defeat. She reached into her ruined handbag, pulled out her gold-plated smartphone, and retrieved her platinum credit card. She confidently declared they would simply check into the penthouse suite at the Plaza Hotel until Desmond posted bail. Vivian dialed the premium concierge service, her hands shaking from the bitter cold. She barked her reservation orders into the phone, reading off her card number with desperate authority. The concierge placed her on a brief hold. A minute later, the representative returned to the line. He politely informed Vivian that her platinum account was completely frozen. Furious, she pulled out a second card, then a third. Every single account returned a severe red flag decline. Jada frantically opened the mobile banking app on her phone. She tried to access the joint accounts she shared with Bradley, hoping to find a hidden cash reserve. A stark, bright red warning banner flashed across her screen. The application stated that all her financial assets were currently under federal review. Because Bradley had used their joint accounts to attempt his offshore money laundering scheme at the airport, the FBI had initiated a total asset freeze. Jada had zero access to cash. She could not even afford to buy a cup of coffee to warm her freezing hands. The reality of absolute financial ruin crashed down on them right there on the wet concrete. They were completely and utterly broke. Panic fully consumed Jada. She quickly opened her contacts and dialed her maid of honor, a wealthy heiress from an old money family in Brooklyn. The call went straight to a disconnected voicemail tone. Jada dialed another prominent bridesmaid, a woman who had gladly drunk $300 champagne at her engagement gala. The woman actually answered the phone. Jada begged for a place to stay, sobbing about a terrible legal misunderstanding. The former friend let out a harsh, cruel laugh. She told Jada that the entire city had just watched Bradley get dragged out of the Supreme Court in federal handcuffs on the evening news. She called Jada a pathetic scam artist, told her to never call that number again, and aggressively hung up the phone. Jada dropped her device, staring blankly at the dark screen as her elite social circle completely erased her existence. Vivian, trembling violently in the sleet, decided to use her final lifeline. She dialed Pastor Evans. She thought her decades of generous donations and senior deacon status would guarantee her sanctuary. Pastor Evans answered, but his voice lacked any trace of pastoral warmth. It was completely made of ice. He informed Vivian that the church elders had held an emergency meeting the moment Desmond was arrested. Because Desmond had leveraged the Sacred Church Building Fund to facilitate a federal money laundering scheme, the board had officially excommunicated both of them. Pastor Evans stated they were permanently stripped of their deacon titles, banned from the church property, and shunned by the entire congregation. The pastor hung up, severing their final tie to the Harlem elite. Vivian and Jada stood alone on the dark, freezing street. The high society they had worshipped, the wealthy friends they had desperately tried to impress, and the religious community they had used for leverage had all simultaneously turned their backs on them. They were entirely isolated, stripped of their fake prestige, and exposed to the harsh, unforgiving elements of the city. The sleet soaked through their expensive clothes, chilling them to the absolute bone. They looked at the mountain of trash bags holding their ruined possessions. They had no money for a hotel. They had no credit to hail a cab. They had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Every single bridge they built was completely burned to the very ground. Vivian looked down the dark, rainy street, a look of profound, agonizing defeat washing over her face. She finally made a cold, desperate, and incredibly humiliating calculation. There was only one person left in the entire city who owned a building. There was only one roof they could possibly seek shelter under. They gathered a few intact trash bags, dragging them across the wet pavement. Defeated, freezing, and utterly broken, Vivian and Jada began the long, humiliating walk through the pouring rain, heading straight toward the historic Harlem brownstone they had tried to steal. I watched their pathetic approach through the high-definition security monitors mounted on the parlor wall. The freezing rain was coming down in thick, relentless sheets, blurring the amber streetlights. But the advanced night vision lenses captured every miserable detail. Vivian and Jada were trudging down the flooded sidewalk, desperately dragging their waterlogged black trash bags behind them. Their expensive silk dresses clung to their shivering bodies, completely ruined by the brutal winter storm. They looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant elite socialites who had tried to banish me to the streets just a few weeks ago. They looked exactly like what they were, broken, desperate frauds who had finally run out of other people's money to steal. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot chamomile tea, letting the comforting warmth spread through my chest as I stood in the grand entryway of my beautifully restored historic Harlem brownstone. The heavy oak front doors stood between my absolute peace and their complete destruction. A few seconds later, the frantic, aggressive pounding began. The heavy brass knocker slammed against the wood, accompanied by the muffled, hysterical sounds of my mother sobbing. "Sienna," Vivian wailed, banging her bare fists against the thick oak. "Sienna, please open the door. It is freezing out here. We do not have anywhere else to go." I did not rush. I set my teacup down on the polished mahogany console table and casually unlocked the multiple deadbolts I had installed since regaining full control of my property. I swung the heavy doors open. The bitter, freezing wind whipped into the warm foyer, but I stood my ground. Vivian and Jada practically fell forward, shivering violently, their makeup running in dark, messy streaks down their faces. Jada was clutching a torn garbage bag full of ruined designer shoes, her teeth chattering so loudly I could hear them over the storm. "Thank God," Vivian gasped, trying to push her way past me into the warm, brightly lit hallway. "Sienna, let us inside right now. We are going to catch pneumonia. The building manager at the penthouse locked us out, and the church elders have completely excommunicated us. We have absolutely nothing left." I did not move a single inch. I planted my feet firmly on the threshold, using my physical presence to completely block their entry. "You have exactly what you earned, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through the freezing rain like a razor blade. "Step back off my porch." Vivian froze, her eyes widening in absolute shock. She genuinely believed that her tears would instantly erase decades of severe psychological abuse. "Sienna, you cannot do this to us," she cried, reaching out with a trembling hand to grab my arm. "We are your family. Your father is sitting in a federal holding cell. The FBI seized all of our bank accounts. We are completely destitute. Family is supposed to protect family in times of crisis. Do not dare use that word with me." I fired back aggressively, slapping her cold hand away from my sweater. Family does not forge a medical conservatorship to declare their own daughter mentally incompetent. Family does not illegally mortgage a historic inheritance to fund a white developer who treats our legacy like a joke. You did not come here because you love me, Mom. You came here because I am the only person left in this city whose pockets you have not completely emptied. Jada pushed her way to the front, her entire body shaking from the bitter cold. The arrogant, condescending bride-to-be was completely gone. She looked small, pathetic, and entirely terrified. "Sienna, please," Jada begged, her voice cracking as fresh tears mixed with the freezing rain on her cheeks. "Bradley left me with a mountain of debt. My friends blocked my number. I do not have a single dollar to my name. Just let us sleep in the basement. I will take your old room. I will not complain. I will do whatever you want." I looked at my younger sister, remembering exactly how she had laughed and sipped a mimosa while handing me a fake eviction notice on Christmas morning. I remembered how she had stood in the country club calling me a crazy black woman for defending my own property. "The basement is currently under construction, Jada." I smiled coldly, throwing her own cruel words right back in her face. "I am gutting it to build a custom wine cellar. I cannot have glorified squatters living downstairs. It ruins the aesthetic of my multi-million-dollar private equity firm." Jada let out a strangled, agonizing sob, collapsing to her knees, right there on the wet concrete porch. She buried her face in her hands, crying uncontrollably, as the stark reality of her homelessness finally broke her spirit. Vivian dropped to her knees beside her golden child, looking up at me with sheer, unfiltered desperation. The high society church deacon was now groveling on the freezing floor, begging for scraps from the daughter she had ruthlessly discarded. "Sienna, I am begging you as your mother," Vivian pleaded, her voice hoarse and broken. "Just give us one night. Just let us sleep on the floor in the hallway. We will pay you back. We will pay rent. We will do anything you ask, please. Just name your price." I looked down at the two women shivering at my feet. They were finally offering to pay for the space they had tried to steal. The absolute irony was delicious, but I was not running a charity for unrepentant criminals. I reached into the pocket of my tailored trousers and pulled out a crisp, folded legal document. "You want to talk about rent?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that chilled them more than the storm. "That is incredibly funny, Mom, because I spent the entire afternoon reviewing the forensic audit of your domestic accounts." I unfolded the thick document and held it out in the freezing rain. Vivian stared at the paperwork with wide, terrified eyes, too cold and defeated to reach up and take it from my hand. "I am not giving you a place to sleep," I stated with absolute finality, staring down at my ruined family. "But since you are so eager to discuss financial obligations, I figured I would return the exact favor you gave me on Christmas morning. Here is your bill." Vivian reached out with a trembling hand, her wet, frozen fingers grasping the crisp sheet of paper. She blinked through the heavy rain, trying to read the bold numbers printed at the bottom of the page. Jada leaned over her shoulder, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely speak. The document was a meticulously itemized invoice printed on my official corporate letterhead. It detailed exactly $210,000 in base rent, multiplied by standard market interest rates, plus the emotional distress penalty they had tried to sue me for in their frivolous defamation case. The grand total was a staggering $315,000. "What is this?" Vivian gasped, her voice barely a whisper against the howling wind. "Sienna, you cannot be serious. We are completely bankrupt. The federal government seized all of our financial assets. We do not have $300,000 to give you." "Then you better start finding some very lucrative jobs, Mom," I replied, crossing my arms over my warm cashmere sweater. Because that is the exact amount you extorted from me while lying about the ownership of this very house. You charged me illegal rent to live in a basement I already owned, and you used my hard-earned cash to fund Bradley's fraudulent schemes. You took advantage of my grief to steal my very own inheritance. Jada stared at the invoice, shaking her head frantically. We are your family, Sienna. You cannot just hand us a bill and leave us out here in a winter storm. Bradley took everything from me. He ruined my entire life. You have millions of dollars now. You own his entire company. Why are you punishing us for what he did? I am not punishing you for what Bradley did, Jada, I stated, staring right into my sister's desperate eyes. I am holding you accountable for what you did. You happily drank champagne and mocked my career while handing me a fake eviction notice. You stood in front of the entire church congregation and called me a jealous, mentally unstable woman just to protect your fake elite status. You did not care about my survival when you thought you were marrying a billionaire. You only care about family loyalty now because your credit cards are declining and your designer shoes are sitting in a garbage pile on the sidewalk. You made your own bed, now you sleep in it. Vivian fell forward, grabbing the doorframe to keep herself from collapsing onto the freezing porch. Please, Sienna, the Lord commands us to forgive. I am your mother. I carried you. I raised you. You cannot turn a blind eye to your own mother freezing in the cold streets. God will judge you for this cruelty. Do not dare use God to manipulate me, Mom. I fired back, my voice echoing like thunder over the pouring rain. You used the church building fund to launder stolen money. You stood at the holy pulpit and bore false witness against your own daughter. You worshipped money status and the approval of elite socialites over your own flesh and blood. You made your altar out of greed, and now it has collapsed right on top of you. God is not judging me today. He is delivering your consequences. I stepped backward into the warm, brightly lit foyer of my brownstone. I looked at the two women shivering on the porch. For my entire life, I had craved their approval. I had worked myself to the bone trying to prove my worth, hoping that one day they would see me as an equal rather than a burden or a disposable financial resource to be exploited. But looking at them now, stripped of their fake wealth and arrogant pride, I felt absolutely nothing. The desperate need for their validation had completely evaporated, replaced by a profound, impenetrable peace. The invoice has a net 30-day payment term, I announced, grabbing the heavy brass handle of the oak door. If the balance is not paid in full by the end of next month, my corporate attorneys will file a civil lawsuit to garnish whatever future wages you manage to earn. Do not ever return to this property. Do not attempt to ever call me. You are officially evicted from my entire life. Vivian let out a piercing, agonizing wail, lunging forward to stop the door. Sienna, no, please, you cannot do this to us. Have mercy. I did not even hesitate. I slammed the heavy oak door completely shut, the thick wood cutting off her desperate scream. I turned the brass deadbolt, drove the heavy metal chain into place, and engaged the electronic security system. The digital panel beeped, confirming the house was entirely locked down and secure. I stood in the quiet foyer for a long moment. Outside, the muffled sounds of the winter storm raged on, accompanied by the faint, pathetic sound of Jada pounding her fists against the solid wood. I did not flinch. I simply turned around and walked confidently away, moving through the silent, historic hallways of the brownstone. I felt a massive, suffocating weight lift off my shoulders. I walked into my grandfather's old study, the room where I had uncovered the hidden ledger that saved my life. I poured myself a fresh cup of hot chamomile tea and sat down in his vintage leather armchair. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, casting a golden glow across the dark wood paneling and the antique bookshelves lining the walls. I had finally severed the toxic cord that had bound me to their narcissistic abuse for over 3 decades. They were outside in the freezing rain, facing the brutal reality of the criminal choices they had made, while I was sitting comfortably in the house my grandfather built, surrounded by the wealth I had rightfully secured. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute quiet. The war was officially over, and I had won everything. 6 months later, the bright spring sun beautifully bathed the historic streets of Harlem in radiant golden light. I stood across from my grandfather's brownstone, holding artisan coffee, admiring the view. The scaffolding that briefly covered the property was gone. I hired specialized black architects to meticulously restore the masonry. The intricate stonework my grandfather carved looked absolutely magnificent, standing as a proud, untouchable testament to our family legacy. I crossed the street and walked up the pristine steps. Next to the heavy oak doors, a gleaming bronze plaque caught the morning light. It read Hayes Financial Empowerment. I unlocked the door and stepped inside the parlor floor, which I had transformed into headquarters for my new firm. The space was bright and modern, featuring vibrant artwork by local women of color and sleek workspaces. I took my extensive expertise as a forensic auditor and built a highly successful wealth management firm dedicated to helping women protect their assets from financial abuse. I was teaching them how to secure legacies, read complex contracts, and never allow anyone to leverage their futures. My lead associate, Maya, walked out of her office holding a stack of pristine legal portfolios. She smiled warmly, handing me the morning briefing. Our client roster was completely full. Women from all over the city, from successful entrepreneurs to single mothers, rebuilding their lives, trusted us to safeguard their wealth. We were thriving, generating massive clean profits that did not require deception or fake social climbing. We received final settlement documents from the federal prosecutor, Maya said, tapping a folder. The bankruptcy liquidation for Vanguard Equity Partners is officially closed. All stolen funds are reallocated and the remaining debt wiped. I took the folder, walking into my spacious corner office, taking a seat at my custom mahogany desk. I reviewed the final court transcripts. Justice had been swift and merciless. Bradley was serving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and interstate embezzlement. Without his expensive lawyers and his completely fake developer persona, he was just another convicted, disgraced white-collar criminal. My father, Desmond, took a harsh plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial. I was serving 5 years for aggravated identity theft and forging a medical conservatorship. The judge had shown zero leniency, especially after hearing how he tried to weaponize the mental health system against his own daughter. As for Vivian and Jada, their glamorous elite lifestyle evaporated into thin air. Without Desmond's stolen money or Bradley's fake real estate empire to prop them up, they faced the harsh reality of their incompetence. I heard through the Harlem grapevine that they were currently sharing a very cramped one-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood. Vivian was working as a shift manager at a discount retail store, dealing with angry customers instead of attending high-society tea parties. Jada took a job as a receptionist at a low-tier car dealership. Her massive diamond engagement ring was seized by federal agents to pay off Bradley's defrauded investors. They were entirely shunned by the church and permanently blacklisted by the wealthy social circles they sacrificed my life to impress. I closed the legal folder and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk. I locked the drawer, finalizing that dark chapter of my life forever. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for them. They dug their own graves with their unhinged greed and insufferable arrogance. They tried to bury me in the dirt, but they did not realize I was a seed. I walked out of my office and headed toward the back of the brownstone, making my way down the newly renovated staircase. The damp, windowless basement, where my parents banished me for 5 years, was completely gone. I gutted the entire space and built the exact luxurious custom wine cellar Jada and Bradley had planned to build. It featured floor-to-ceiling mahogany wine racks, climate-controlled glass displays, and a truly beautiful tasting lounge with plush velvet seating. It was the ultimate ironic monument to my victory. I walked over to the tasting table and picked up a bottle of rare, expensive vintage champagne. I popped the cork, the satisfying sound echoing through the peaceful room. I poured a glass and proudly raised it toward a framed photograph of my beloved grandfather resting on the mantel. He was smiling in the picture, standing proudly in front of this very house decades ago. I kept my promise to him. I protected our history, and I ensured that his hard-earned wealth would never be exploited by greedy opportunists again. Taking a slow, deliberate sip of the crisp champagne, I reveled in the absolute unbreakable silence of my home. I was 34 years old, a multi-millionaire, and the undisputed master of my own destiny. I had outsmarted a corrupt developer, dismantled a federal money laundering scheme, and evicted the toxic abusers who masqueraded as my family. I transformed their betrayal into my greatest triumph. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you become the very monsters you have to defeat. But when you finally stop seeking their validation and start recognizing your immense power, you become completely unstoppable. You do not need to scream, you do not need to beg, and you certainly do not need to settle for a basement when you rightfully own the entire estate. You just need to follow the math, secure your assets, and hand them the invoice for their destruction. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family and build your empire from the ground up, let me know your story in the comments below. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that their worth is never determined by people who refuse to see their value. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, the best revenge is always massive, unbothered success.